Hello or namaste. Welcome to Atypical Dikkate, a conversation podcast. I'm your host Soumya, and in this podcast, I talk to fellow queer, neurodivergent, and disabled folks. This podcast is not just a repository of stories and experiences, but it is also a journey to build solidarity, queer intimacy, and a community while highlighting neglected issues including sexual and reproductive health and rights. Today, I have Kinza with me. Kinza is a queer Pasmanda Muslim minority and an intersectional feminist who works as ASAR HRJ practitioner, encouraging and ensuring a young feminist and rights based approach. She's a certified social worker and has done her master's in gender studies from Jamia Millia Islamia Central University, New Delhi. Kinza is a social justice activist who is actively advocating against decolonizing for issues like the prevention of gender based violence and discrimination with a focus on emotional violence against women, children, and gender diverse people. Foregrounding diversity, equity, and inclusivity, sexual reproductive health rights and justice, adolescent youth leadership, and mental health and well being. The approach she has been following in her work is collective liberation and trauma informed care centric for a safer and accessible space for all, which has aided in her understanding of feminist leadership to include and often center leisure and the space for vulnerability. Kinza is an active part of the anti capitalist, casteist, colonialist, and fascist decolonial movements and believes in the ideology of collective liberation for all. Hello, Kinza. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello, Soumya. So, before starting, I would like to first thank you for reaching out to me and also thinking of identities who doesn't have such visibilization in mainstream media and thinking of identities like me and bringing voices and including all of us. I would like to take one word out of it, which is very important to me, and I would like to break it down. A very important, crucial part of my identity, which is queer, Pasmanda, and Muslim. So, I am a queer person, I'm a non binary person, and I would like to make people understand what Pasmanda means before we start. So, Pasmanda means people who are left behind. It is a word, it is an Urdu word which has been used for centuries for people who have been left behind, who are from marginalized caste, who are scheduled caste, scheduled tribe. And for Muslims, this is the term. For example, for non-Muslims, there are people who use Dalit, Bahujan. But yes, there are some Muslim who does use Dalit Muslim. And for me, we use because it beautifully explains that yes, we are the people who were left behind. And if we also see constitutionally, we were left behind. 85% of Muslims in India are converted Muslims and are scheduled caste, are scheduled tribe. But they have been excluded after the Mandal Commission came that we cannot access our rights as scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. We cannot access a lot of resources which are rightfully ours and are reserved for us, but because of the Mandal Commission. So we rightfully claim when we say Pasmanda, we are the people who are left behind and we are here to stay and here to reclaim our spaces because in Islam scriptures, yes, it is true that there is no caste system, but in South Asian Muslims, caste system is very much there, and I want to foreground that reality and share that truth with everyone. When I say that I'm a queer Pasmanda Muslim, people should know that caste system exists in Muslims as well, and it is very inherent, it is very deep, and it has a real impact on our daily lives.
Thank you for that, and also for beginning this conversation with your identity, your personal journey. And I would just like to take it a little ahead to jump into the theme of this discussion, that is ASAR-HRJ. So, how did your early experiences of puberty, menstrual health, and religious teachings around sexuality shape your understanding of ASAR-HR as a Pasmanda queer Muslim?
Justice came at a very maybe in mid-20s, but access to it came in the beginning of 20s. And even before, when I got my periods, there was always a conversation about purification and purities around me, and which in Urdu we say pak. Pak is the word for it. Paki, napaki is the word for impurity. And I have been raised with a lot of assertion of what pureness actually means. Even before I got my menstruation, my periods, I used to hear these words. I was taught how to wash my hands. It has to be 3 times, or I'll not be pure enough for the God. I will not be worthy enough for the love of Allah. And all of these things were constantly there. So when I first got my periods, I remember I was told about periods through some of my cousins who had their periods earlier, and I lived in a very conservative a family where about 25 to 30 people used to live in one house, and it was a joint family and was extremely orthodox. It still is. I thankfully got out with my family and we moved to Delhi, but I come from a hometown which is Meerut, which has a lot of history in resistance movement and in a lot of things, but it is also regressive, highly patriarchal and very conservative. So when I first got to know about periods, it was very little to no information. It's just I knew that one day I'll bleed. So the first time when I started bleeding, I had no one to rely on or ask what is going on. For 3 days, I just avoided it. But then finally, when I was concerned, I shared it with my elder sibling, and they called my grandmother. And my grandmother instructed me, rip the back part of the pad and apply it. And that was the only information I received. So I started using sanitary pads, and then my mother checked the sanitary pads, and then she asked, "You're not bleeding?" So because I did not know how to apply a pad and I was just told to rip it off, I was applying it the other way round. So that was my first understanding of, oh, this is how you are supposed to apply pads. But even then, my mother did not teach me how periods happen, how does a uterus function, why is it happening to me. It's just that now I'm big and now I have to deal with all of these things for the rest of my life. But the instructions I remember which I was given were more about the purification part of it, not the menstrual health management. And I think it is a little part of menstrual health management, but it was more about purification. So there is a practice, and ghusl is a practice which is done by all the genders, and it is instructed and to all the genders that you have to do this practice when you hit puberty, and it is an act of purification. So in this practice, what you do is that you bath in a particular way, but before even bathing, you have to step by step do particular step before the pre preparation for the ghusl. And most of the people, even from the Muslim community, will, I think, always support the practice of ghusl. But I will also talk about the real life implications on queer people, on women, on young girls, on young men, young boys, and how it impacts people in general and how it impacts their mental health. But first, I'll explain the practice. So before ghusl, I have to make sure that I have to remove all my pubic region hairs and my underarm hairs within 40 days. And if I don't do it, and if even a single strand of hair is left on my body, then I'll be cursed. I'll be cursed by the earth I'm walking on. I'll be cursed by the angels. I will be cursed. And imagine a 11-year-old, a 8-year-old who is having their period for the first time. People experiencing puberty for the first time, getting this information that if they don't follow certain purification rules, they'll be cursed. The earth will shame them. They are impure. It is ingrained from that level. So I cannot have nail paints on my nails. All genders are not supposed to have nail paint. They also teach us this is the length and the amount in which the hair can exist. So imagine being instructed with such detailing that you have to remove your pubes. And for people who are born with uteruses, who have vulvas, and people who identify as women or as gender diverse people, those people are said that you cannot use razors or blades. So now you have to remove your pubes from a chemical cream or powders. There are different ways. For example, my grandmother used to tell me that she used to remove her pubes one by one by using ashes. And all of this information, what I'm sharing about ghusl, is a practice of hadith and not written in the Quran. I'll also explain what is hadith. Hadith is a scripture which are practices of Prophet Muhammad. It is sunnah, but it is written by a lot of followers. It is not the ultimate scripture of Islam, and it is written by men, obviously. But in Quran, all of this information is not there. Like in Quran, this information about ghusl is very different. Before ghusl, we have to do all of this. That clean your bathroom 3 times, purify it, remove your pubes. And there is a strict book that, this is how you need to remove them. And for men can use razors. People who have penises, they can use razors, they can use scissors, but they also need to remove it. And ghusl is done to purify in 3 conditions. If you have menstruation, if you have nightfall, if you like more than 3, if you have intercourse with your partner, and if you masturbate. These are the 4 conditions. So now, where you have to practice ghusl. So imagine a woman who has just given birth to a child, and it's been 2 or 3 months for them after their periods have stopped, and they need to purify them, and it's December and they're breastfeeding their child, so they have to. And in ghusl, it is mandatory that you wash your hairs as well. So ghusl cannot be accepted if you only clean up yourself from just below. So all of these steps of ghusl, because this practice is very, very much glorified in the religion, and I will share my experience of it because my mother is also a neurodivergent person, love rules, and was very specific about these rules and very obsessed with cleanliness and hygiene and everything. In the early stages, she used to remove my pubes. So I used to stand 11-year-old in front of her who is just experiencing bodily changes, who has no clue why all of this is happening. And because she's my mother, so I still feel safe, but still very shameful about my body. So she's cleaning my pubes. She's also standing while I'm bathing and making sure that I follow every step. And what these chemical creams did to our vulvas was that we used to have burning urination. Our skin used to get cut because of the chemicals. We faced boils over our genitals. There are infections which occurs due to these creams, and because we cannot use razors also. The implication of it and the impact of it was also very bad. And we complied because we thought if we don't do all of these things, and we were told that period blood is bad blood, it is not good. So we were forced and also be obeyed because we thought that we are impure. There is blood coming out of our genital, and genitals are always shown as a very dirty part of the body because you are excreting your waste, human waste out of it. So it is always shown as a very degrading part of your body. I was monitored while I was doing all of this. My privacy was violated. And now imagine for a newly married bride, it is also a practice to monitor that if the marriage is consummated or not. Because you cannot perform namaz without performing ghusl. And your hairs have to be wet. And if they're not wet, it means you have not consummated the marriage, or you have not performed ghusl, or you'll be judged for your morality, your piousness, your purity and everything. And how does it impact your sexual health, your mental health? Constantly being in a fear that you're not pure. But moving forward, I got access to contraceptives in the age of 20. In 21, when I was 21 years old, I got to understand why menstruation happened. What are the role of menstrual health management? What are these pointers I need to focus on? And especially when I started studying masters in gender studies, I got more understanding of my sexual reproductive health, rights and justice. I understand how my sexuality is being controlled by it, my mobility is being controlled by it. And ghusl is the commonest practice, which is seen as a very hygiene centered, very, you look at it in a way that it is just bathing. And in bathing also, there are steps. You have to first clean your hands, then your body, then you do wuzu, which you do before namaz. So making sure all of it happens, and it is also a tracking practice. It does hampers it, because then people avoid, I will have to do ghusl. For example, Ramzan happens, right? During fasting, you cannot have sex, you cannot masturbate. You have to perform ghusl because you have to fast. And you cannot fast if you're not pure. It has real mental health implications. For example, for me, for years, I thought that I'm impure. I'm not worthy of God. And if we are speaking of Maspanna Muslims, and if we are talking about, because in Muslims also, we think that Muslims have just one clan. There are different clans, there are different communities. There is a Shia community, they will have different rules about ghusl. There is Barelvi is a community which the people who go to Dargah. So, for example, some Muslims who are Sunni Muslims will not go to Dargah. Barelvi will go to Dargah. So, there are different diversities within the Muslim community as well. So, and if there is a tribal community, they have different practices. So, if I look at it in that way, this practice or even access to SRHRJ is impacting people very much, and has impacted me personally as well.
And in my family, they taught the same thing. Even if you have your periods at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning, you have to take a bath from head to toe. You have to put the cow's excreta, gobar in that water. Then you have to put haldi, and then you have to bathe with that water. And I had so many fights. Now I don't do it. And then I learned to hide it, right? Like within the washroom, I'll just throw away these things and then take a bath. There's been a time where my mom has sprinkled Ganga Jal on me. It's that, imagine what the kind of mentally, emotionally, how you feel. If you call this abuse, people will take it as an offense.
This is not menstrual health management, this is trauma.
What does queerness mean to you, especially in this context of your faith, caste, and community identity?
First of all, I'll just explain what does it mean to me. So for me, queerness is Kinza can be anything, everything Kinza wants to be. So I am very fluid and that's how I look at queerness also. But in the context of my faith, so we were taught always when we were being raised, we were always told that Islam is a religion where there is no idol worship, right? So we were always taught that we're not supposed to imagine Allah. Allah is this one energy, light, and we're not supposed to imagine how Allah look, how they are, how their body is, who they are. We were always taught that Allah doesn't have a gender. Allah is genderless. So Allah is not a woman, not a man. And at that time, yes, it was very beautiful to be raised by a teaching. You're not supposed to imagine a God as a person, because Allah has created everything, and how can that entity, that beautiful energy which is existing in everyone, is supposed to look in a certain way or like a particular gender. And at that time, I did not realize the heavy worth of this statement, of this learning. But the more I experienced violence around me regarding homosexuality, regarding queerness, people quoting religion, people quoting Islamic scriptures, people spreading Islamophobia on the basis of saying that Islam doesn't accept so and so homosexuality. If you go and read Quran, even in the context of SRHR, there is a lot of flexibility. In Quran, the practice of ghusl also, you can just, if you don't have water, you can just touch the soil and you can just rub it in your face, and then you can just offer prayer. It is that flexible. So even when you read about homosexuality in Quran, there is nothing. Only two stories have been selectively used because selective texting does reflect in a way that people use it against people, against cultures, against community. Because these books are also mythologies, historical books, and a lot of information is coming from ideas and people. So in Quran also, there is a story of a community called Lut, and they faced atrocities. And it is also important when we read any text, we need to also understand from which time it is coming. At that time, people were practicing female infanticide, people were killing people, there were sex slaves, there were wars going on, and they were documenting the history. They were not saying that you need to practice it like this, you need to accept all of it like this. And if I read specifically on the basis of sex, in Quran there is nothing written about lesbians or pansexuals or trans women or trans people. The only mention of sex is in that Lut story, homosexuality. It is also not stated as it is that they were subjugated to violence because they were homosexuals. It was written that they were not being good people. They were spreading hatred. They were doing certain things which were not acceptable in Islam, which is not actually homosexuality. The mention of homosexuality doesn't exist like that. But because the existence of homosexuality is there in the community, that is how they are using it. But and also, if we look at intersex bodies, there are 40 recognized intersex variations currently, and there might be many more. And intersex bodies are if we are quoting natural biological essentialism on everyone and we are imposing that, so then intersex bodies are the correct example of Allah constantly showing people that Allah is queer. Allah accepts queerness. Allah is giving birth to all of these queer bodies, all of these intersex bodies, and we are forcing binaries on these bodies by forced operations, by forced subjugation of gender binary. We are the people who are homophobic. Allah isn't. Allah is never telling people to hate people or kill people on the basis of who they love, who they have sex with. The only description of sex is also this in Quran, that you cannot have anal sex. But I think because Islam is a lot of medical science also. If you read Quran, they are also teaching this is how you should wash your face, this is what you should eat, this is how you should treat people. And the more Islam I've read, it is mostly talking about the intention of people. It is talking about peace, humility. Allah is talking about that you have to accept everyone. You cannot accept every diverse reality because you don't know what is going on in the heart of a person. For example, there is an example of a pharaoh ruler, whose body is still intact in Egyptian mummies. And the example is there that this person used to defy Allah and everything, but at the time of their death, this person accepted that I accept that there is one God. And Allah preserved their body as an example to show people that. So, for example, people use this term a lot, kafir la idbar, that people who doesn't believe in Allah, not believable. Kafir means people non-believers. But Allah has also, while people quote this statement, Allah has also said that you cannot tell or say or assume that someone is a kafir, because there are people like Pharaoh who said that they don't believe in God, but at the time of their death, in their heart, they said that, no, I believe there is one God. I believe in kindness. So, for example, right now, there can be a lot of fascist, bigoted people who are complying with a lot of violence. There can be people who are spreading hate due to whatever reasons, due to survival, due to etc., many things. But we cannot harm them on the basis of what they're saying because we don't know what's there in their heart. So these were the teachings I was raised with about Islam, that you cannot assume or hurt people on the basis of your preconceived notions. And Allah was constantly there is no mention of man, woman. There is always, when we, like in Quran, if you read, it is always companion. Marriage is not mandatory. A lot of things are very flexible if you read the text. But because people have not read the text, and most of the text was interpreted by obviously men, because they were given the access to education, and people who had uteruses, vulva, or were gender diverse were never given the access or knowledge to even interpret the text or understand the text. And these selective texting have been used by Islamic extremists, have been used by Hindu extremists, has been used by a lot of extremists, Christian extremists also. People in USA also have used these texts, but similarly of other religions also. To spread hate, you use a particular text and show that a particular religion is this. And this idea of queerness within my faith, within my caste and community also, that's how I understand it. And that's how, and I live and thrive in a community where I encounter beautiful queer Muslims, and we live with our faith. I am a practicing Muslim, and I have a lot of people who are Muslim, because we love Allah. Allah is queer, Allah is genderless, and Allah is teaching, giving examples of so many beautiful examples daily. We have seahorses in nature, we have gay penguins in nature, we have so much biological examples of it. And if people can justify forceful intersex surgeries by saying that they are doing the God deed, but God is giving birth to such diverse identities, how are we supposed to say that Allah is homophobic when clearly we are as a community? So that's how I perceive Islam or Allah, and that's how I was raised, that don't judge people on the basis of their actions. You don't know what's there in their heart. Don't like, I was taught so much humility, beauty, peace from where I come from. Yes, there were orthodox practices, because yes, I was born with a uterus and a vulva, and I will be subjugated to a violence which is a cultural violence. Patriarchy is a cultural violence, not a particular religion problem. It is a community problem. And when it comes to caste, because obviously as a Pasmanda Muslim, you will face more violence as compared to, for example, if I'll talk about this, that Allah is square, if I'll talk about ghusl, I will be targeted more as compared to a person who is an upper caste Muslim. Because upper caste Muslims have privileges, resources.
You mentioned briefly that you were able to access contraception and reproductive health only during your 20s. Can you share how your access to this knowledge changed your life? What challenges you faced? Your personal experiences when it comes to SRHRJ? And I would like you to actually link it from your work in SRHR training and community-based capacity building, the gaps that you have noticed with all the identities that you carry, and how has it impacted you, and what is the way forward according to you?
The access of contraception did change my life. Earlier I used to feel guilty for actually experiencing my sexuality, taking a stand for it, because a lot of things have been taught to us which were not right, which were false practices. And I used the text which was being used against my identity. I used the text to educate myself, to understand from where the thoughts are coming. My degrees helped me, my oppression helped me, my lived experiences helped me to break it down, how all of this is linked to maintaining a community power. For example, if just like Baba Saheb shared that to break Brahminical patriarchy, intercaste marriages are the biggest tool. So for example, if a queer Muslim or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Christian, all of us decide to marry each other or love within our communities, what community is left? No community is left, because all of us are mixed now. But to maintain the purity and the eugenics or the control over community, what they do is they force religious false practices and text on people who have uteruses and who are queer and gender diverse. So they do this, and especially for accessing contraception, accessing abortion. So I have had women around me. And that's how, first of all, I use the information I was receiving from the institutions, from the people around me. And I kept reading the text I had to understand from where all of this violence is coming. And most of these religious extremists have also not read the text themselves, or also, or if they have used it or interpreted it as per as their convenience. So I read all the text and I read all the existing resources I had. Internet was a blessing to access all of the information, and then I understood that how all of these controls and all of these practices and policies in the religion are used to control my mobility, my sexuality, and people around me, and how the shame and guilt of being pure, celibate, or marrying within the community, or all of these things which we were raised with are impacting us to access our bodily autonomy. I've had women around me from my community, women who are close to me, share that when they gave birth, they were not asked for the consent to insert property in them, but like their partners were asked and they signed it. And their partners also did not know what property was. And they were inserted with property, with IUDs, without their consent. I have had women around me, because this is also again a false practice to tell women that, and how marital sex is also existing within this, through these practices, that you're supposed to serve your husband, when in actual text nothing is there. But the false books does consist how to be a good wife. And when it comes to abortion is a stigma around me, not in just Muslim community, in Dalit communities, in non-Muslims communities, like it is everywhere. To even able to understand them, how having access to abortion, access to information, access, and just giving access to this information isn't enough. Now I'll come to the community and capacity building part of it, that how my own on ground experiences, for example, when we see these NGOs, we see these big organizations talking about sexual reproductive health rights and justice, and they have design trainings, they have design trainings on the basis of comprehensive sexuality education, providing information about contraceptions and how to use them. They will go within the communities, in communities where they don't even have money to even buy a sanitary pad. They will go in those communities, they will hoard funds for these training from the funders, and you go in these trainings, and as a person who is a Dalit Muslim, who's a Pasmanda Muslim, I'll go in these communities and talk to the people from my community also. Okay, I will talk to people, because most of the marginalized communities we work with are Dalit Muslim, are Dalit people. You are, and I have seen the difference between people who were from marginalized caste giving trainings and people who were from upper caste backgrounds or with a lot of social capital. Obviously, they had a lot of point to point information about what contraception provides, what is clitoris, what is the function of uterus. They know all of this. They're very up to date with all the new contraceptives, with all the knowledge. But what they're not up to date is with the cultural context. For example, coming back to from where I started, a 11-year-old who has a 8-year-old who has been taught that purity is a part of their body and they have to maintain it, and if they don't maintain it, they are going to hell. How will you go and teach them? You will go and make it pleasure affirmative, right? Upper caste people like to talk about pleasure, sexual liberation, bodily autonomy in a way which is very disconnected and disengaging for people who are coming from marginalized background, because we are being indoctrinated with shame around our bodies, shame around our needs. Also, we are coming from spaces where 10 people are living in one room. How will I access using a menstrual cup? And how even I will have money to even buy a menstrual cup? I'm not saying access to sexual reproductive health rights justice is not important. It is important, but it has to be intersectional. It has to center intersectional needs. It has to be taught by people who are coming from the community. You need to also make them understand that yes, religious sentiments are important, but also analyzing those religious sentiments through a feminist lens is this is how you do it, not by throwing jargons, not by making them feel excluded, not by valuing their indoctrination, because they are indoctrinated, they are living with shame. You cannot just go into field and just talk about, oh, this is uterus, this is how you get periods, and this is how you need to manage it. You need to talk about shame. You need to talk about the power control, stigma, the caste hierarchy, the idea of purification, which is attached to their bodies. This, and also using words which are in Shuddh Hindi or very complicated English, talking even using words like fallopian tube with a 18-year-old, 8-year-old, even 18-year-old. At the age of 18, I did not know what is clitoris. And speaking that we are having a right-based conversation, you cannot have a right-based conversation until or unless you tell them fallopian tube is a pipe, and in that pipe you have an egg, a ball. That's how you reach out to people.
This is a great segue actually, because you write a lot about decolonializing everything, our work, our language, how that is linked to casteism, how that is linked to Islamophobia in both our professional and personal settings as well. I want to understand that from you. How do you approach this work through a decolonial lens? You have given us a glimpse, especially when it comes to addressing systemic violence.
This is what decolonization is. Yes, I'm not saying all the steps which has been taken till now are worthless, are meaningless. But as we extend our networks, as we extend our practices, we evolve as social workers, we need to understand if you are bringing people from the community to speak about issues, you need to also value them as experts. I have a degree in gender. I have expertise by my qualification also, but I have expertise through my lived experiences also, through my oppression also. I know if I am going to talk to a Pasmanda Muslim young queer, what language I need to use, how I need to approach them. I know how to navigate in that space. But if you will, what these people do is, people who are in power are mostly upper caste and upper class people, and they will be the decision makers of these programs. They will design the programs according to their understanding of sexual reproductive health rights and justice, according to their experiences, which is a very limited lens. You can throw out words like intersectional based and everything, but until or unless you center intersectional needs, nothing will be intersectional. So decolonizing SRHRJ practices while centering their religious sentiments, by also breaking down the historical oppression on their bodies, by also addressing what kind of emotional, because sometimes people don't. Sometimes I did my dissertation in emotional violence through gender discrimination. And what I realized, in the South Asian context, people don't even know what emotional violence is. Putting people like me in decision making positions is important, not just making us do the manual work, but also listening to us in decision making spaces. Not gatekeeping opportunity is also important, because I think allyship is extremely important. No one can work in silos. I'm not saying that upper caste people just should leave these spaces and not contribute their part, but also understand that they need to give up their power and privileges and share the mic, leave the space, provide the knowledge and resources they have, share those resources and knowledge, but bringing in all of us within the conversation. Just like I started, there's nothing about us without us. You need to bring in experts who have lived experiences. But for social work decolonization, I think just talking to people without alternative agendas, sharing knowledges, this is why we came into this space. We came into this space to be kinder. We did not came into this space to be competitive, capitalist in nature. We are looking at people with what they can offer rather than what we can co-create. You cannot talk about SRHRJ without talking about Islamophobia, without talking about casteism, without talking about fascism. Because right now, identities are being displaced, they are facing violence, and in that time, you are talking about gender based violence, but identity based violence is also extremely important. You cannot say that you people who are queer people, you just stick to queer rights. These are your problems. If I'm a queer person, any family planning policy is impacting me, domestic violence act is impacting me, economic policy is impacting me, a disability politics policy is also impacting me. We cannot work in silos.
When we had our initial conversation while we were thinking through the topics to cover, you told me every resistance against systemic oppression is a queer resistance. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Sure.
How do you see collective accountability playing a role in collective liberation? Whose accountability are we demanding, and how do we embody that in our communities? Because we talk about collective accountability, but we also forget individual responsibility sometimes. So how do you
Agreed.
understand it?
I say it and I keep repeating this sentence because I truly believe that my identity is not just of a queer person. My identity is interconnected with a lot of other identities. Queer rights is everything and anything. It is against anything which is enforcing systematic violence. So when I say that every resistance means, by that means, if anyone around me is getting impacted, and the way I see queerness is fluidity, is love beyond boundaries, beyond borders, without any limitations. I am loving radically, and if I am loving radically, then I care about every single issue, and that every single issue is impacting my body of each person. For example, Soumya, you are also impacted with everything which is happening around me. I cannot say that if a person who is a queer person, Muslim, in front of you, who is getting abused or oppressed, that does not impact you. That does impact you. If today they are coming for me, they will come to you also. But even as a human, that has impacted you. Watching violence, ongoing violence around us has impacted us deeply. And how can we not say that every resistance we are making isn't a queer resistance? It is a queer resistance. Every policy impact every identity. Any of us can be a disabled person. Some of has gotten the diagnosis, someone has not gotten the diagnosis, someone has a physical disability, someone has an intellectual disability. We will never know. But that doesn't mean that disability rights will not impact us or economic policy will not impact us. So I think we need to stop separating each other in thematics. Oh, you only talk about climate. We don't need to do this. We need to come up with a sense of humility. Oh, I know 10 points about climate. Would you share your experience of this? And can we work on this together so that we can bring in the issues together? And that's what I am practicing, right? Making friends is the best tool, is the easiest tool to decolonize any system. Until or unless I become your friend, I connect with you on a level of humanity, on emotions, on who we are, I don't think we can create spaces. We will always be disconnected because of the capitalism, because of the shame, because shame keeps us disconnected, disengaged. Capitalism doesn't let us to be present in the little things we experience as human. Also understand that knowledge shouldn't be used to dominate each other, but to support each other. Why are we always capitalizing on emotions? We are forced by capitalism and colonialism to talk about identity politics. An oppressor remains an oppressor because some people who are oppressed are accomplice, are complying with the oppressor. I know that there are reasons because of survival, because of capitalism, because of everything else. But I think it's time that we collectivize. We give up our power the moment we think we don't have power. So I don't think we don't have power. We all have power. We have our voices, even if we don't have capital, we don't have positions which can make decisions, but we do have our voices. I want to talk about the rage, hurt, grief we all are going through in the way we are going through. We still can be kind and assertive at the same time. We can still experience a lot of emotions while we are standing against any kind of systematic oppression. So when I say collective accountability is not just me asking for accountability from people in power, but also people who are beside me, who are standing against systematic violence. But then the question arises, how do we do this? We do this by taking steps and choices on daily basis. So while when we are addressing systematic oppression, I'm not saying that you should lower your voice or you should lower your rage, but also be cognizant of words you are using. For example, direct personal attacks can be avoided in a interpersonal relationship or a professional relationship every single minute. Kindness is a choice. For example, if I want to talk about misogyny, I would not directly go and abuse a man. I will talk about how misogyny impacts all of us. I will talk about how a particular statement is internalized violence. But also, accountability is self reflection. Accountability is asking for people in power for that self reflection. Accountability is learning care, mental health awareness from indigenous people, thinking of people who might not have degrees but also have lived experiences and considering them as experts. I think decolonization of any movement or any resistance is also coming out of the structures which were formed for us. This is how you have to speak, this is how you need to address something. I think foregrounding kindness and also understanding that yes, there can be realities which we have not experienced, which are not our realities. I'm not saying that we need to learn from 20,000 books. Obviously education is important, we should be educated and well informed about certain issues, but the pressure of it is not right. Cancel culture is not right. Receptiveness is important. Understanding that there can be diverse realities, even if I don't understand it, I can still accept the existence of it. I can still choose to be empathetic rather than being a sympathizer. For example, if we take the example of consent, consent is just not yes and no. Consent is diverse, complex, in different relationships, have different power dynamics, have different survival situations in it and tactics. Similarly, when we talk to each other, when we support each other, rather than thinking of each other as a product who is offering four products, four qualities, oh, this product is serving me, this product is now not aligning with my growth, I will discard it. Having relationship beyond the profit of it, having relationships because humans are diverse, we have 20 other emotions existing together and we can coexist together, we can sit with differences, and rather than blaming each other, fighting against each other, we can sit with the gaps, the solutions we can come up with together. I think retaliating through violence, through aggression, in a way which can harm people emotionally and damage people on personal level, we should rather ask systems like capitalism, colonialism, and people in power that how can we do better? How can we center every person and build systems which are meant to serve us and not systems to which we have to serve. Nothing is bigger than us. Everything is alive because we are alive. We can solve it everything together and we can restart every single time we exist. And even after death, the love we have for each other keeps us, our memories, our knowledge alive, and we pass it on together. So even when our voice shakes, even when we feel nervous, even if we think that it will take everything from us, I think not speaking up take a lot from us. And the more we betray ourselves, the more we betray the community around us because we are not being truthful with the people around us and with ourselves also. So not betraying ourselves is important, and the more you listen to your body and your gut, you'll know what is right. So I think that's how we decolonize together, and I'm also learning in a learning space. I'm also self-reflecting, I'm also learning to ask for help, ask to be taken care of, and to care openly. So I'm also in a process of it. And I think asking each other is important, that what kind of support we like. And also, sometimes for some people, maybe asking will also not get us the answer. Looking beyond our own biases, our own restrictions, on our own thoughts on how we want to support people and how we want to be taken care of, that is also important. Sometimes we also don't share our needs. So we can also reflect on our own experiences, that in particular moment, how did I wanted that support to look like for me. We can use our own experiences to understand what kind of care we can give and take.
Thank you so much, Kinza. You foregrounded very beautifully that it's important to speak up and it's also important to listen. It's a building block that will take us to collective liberation.